So, how often have you heard it said recently that one of the many issues with current World of Warcraft is that the story of the more recent expansions, especially Shadowlands, has been frankly terrible and an insult to players who have spent years immersing themselves in the lore of the universe? If you're like me, then you've heard this criticism a lot lately. Now, we all know that currently it's trendy to talk about WoW as though it were the incarnation of all evil, developed by a company with the current PR reputation of a Tyranid hive fleet. But the current debate around the quality of Warcraft's story is something I find interesting, because I really don't see this as a new issue. In fact, I would argue that World of Warcraft has been lagging hard in the story department for years now. This video is going to explore the story of World of Warcraft from Classic through to Cataclysm, and ask, when did WoW's story go bad? And was it ever really any good? I'm not going to go over the specifics of the actual plots, but rather assess how they were delivered in each expansion. So if you're looking for a breakdown of the entire lore of the game, go to another channel like Novel, you'll do it far better than I ever could. Oh, and just as a heads up, this video will cover the story from Classic through to and including Cataclysm. I'll cover everything after Cataclysm in a separate video, just to stop this one from being overly long. So without further ado, let's look at how good the story was in early World of Warcraft. We're going to begin with Classic. Alright, so we're with Vanilla at this stage, all the way back in 2004, a very different era in the history of MMOs and video games in general. In WoW, this was a time before phasing allowed the world to develop in line with story progression outside of major patches, and I think it's important to recognise that people's expectations of what could be delivered in an online video game were very different. After all, at this time, people were still playing on PCs so bulky that they required an industrial crane just to get them up a flight of stairs. This was the period in which Blizzard were interested in fleshing out the world they created, rather than focusing on one clear plot direction as they would do in later expansions. So in Vanilla, there really wasn't much story at all, certainly not a coherent one. In fact, it was about as coherent as a Glasgow hen night. Every patch was like a new episode from a History Channel show. Think about it. Ancient dwarven texts speak of elemental forces beneath the earth. Who are these fiery beings which granted power to the dwarves? When will they re-emerge, and should we be afraid? And coming later in the show, ancient alien god lies beneath the sands, and is a floating city really coming to a town near you? You get the idea. It was bloody bonkers and disjointed as fuck, but you had a whole world to explore at this point, so it was cool all the same. But there really wasn't a conventional story of note at this early stage in the game. Ah, TBC. The beginning of the era of going back to Warcraft 3 and tying up the loose ends from the RTS games. I'm sure the story gets good now then, right? Well, not really. In fact, the premise of TBC basically felt like all you were doing was travelling to the one place not already corrupted by the Scourge.
Space!
Alright, so a lot of players had played and loved Warcraft 3, myself included by the way, and getting to see Illidan, Kael'thas and Lady Vaj again was awesome. It's just a shame that, like with Classic, the story was pretty disjointed in TBC, and I would argue that it was only really Kael'thas that had something of a running plot, outside of certain smaller characters like Teron Gorfin for example, which mainly consisted of him dying several times. With that being said, we did start to get more in the way of voice acted dialogue and scripted events in game, which was pretty cool. But still, if you were to ask a TBC player who didn't play through Warcraft 3, read lore books or look up anything outside of the game they were actually playing, what the story of the expansion was, they'd probably shrug and say, fuck knows dude, but check out my Warglaive, sick right? On to Wrath then. Okay, so I think that Wrath of the Lich King is where things changed for the better in terms of story delivery in World of Warcraft. In my opinion, Wrath was and remains the best attempt Blizzard have made at telling a story within their MMO itself. Yes, Arthas was the most memorable character from Warcraft 3, hands down in my opinion, but you didn't need to have played that game to get to know who he was and know why you wanted to defeat him in WoW. This was clearly conveyed through quests, cinematics, and to put it bluntly, the fact that the bastard kept popping up every 5 fucking minutes to taunt you like a Scooby-Doo villain. This became a bit of a joke within the community, but it still worked really well. You always knew what you were building up towards, and coupled with the immense hype generated by those players who had in fact played Warcraft 3 and the Frozen Throne expansion, it was a really good time to get invested in the plot. But as awesome as the Lich King was, it's important to remember that the plot of Wrath went beyond the simple goal of putting Arthas in the crippler crossface and getting him to apologise for being a very naughty boy. There was also the growing friction between Garrosh and Thrall, the return of Varian Rin, and the journey of Tyrion Fordring in his quest to defeat the Lich King. All of this was good stuff, and was made better by the fact that the plot of Wrath led directly into the story of Cataclysm. A transition which hadn't really occurred before at the end of Classic or TVC. And speaking of Cataclysm, right, so Cataclysm is where things get a little bit weird in my opinion. You see, whilst Wrath's story was interesting primarily because of Arthas and the journey you were on as a player to finally face him down and defeat him atop ICC, Cataclysm was interesting in a completely different way. It was the smaller stories going on in the world around you which really attracted attention, and how the world that you knew so well was being shaped by the events of the expansion. The plight of the Gilneans, the complex leadership of Garrosh, the rise of the Forsaken. All of these subplots were compelling and were told across one or more questlines, making great use of phasing, voice acting, and scripted events. Say what you want about Cata, but it was the first time that I truly felt like I was experiencing a worldwide story as a player. It was really well delivered by Blizzard, I must be honest. What was weird about the expansion though, was that compared to these subplots, the primary story of the return of Deathwing and the desperate attempt to stop him from flame grilling Azeroth with a dash of olive oil was pretty, well, weak. It's difficult enough to make a dragon the lead antagonist of a story, especially if they're never in their human form. It just removes a lot of the relatability of the character, which is ultimately what made Illidan, Arthas and Garrosh interesting foes. With Deathwing though, it's more than just the fact that he was a dragon which makes him a weak villain. His motivation boiled down to little more than the fact that he went a bit mental and society is to blame. There's nothing in the way of possible redemption or a twisted morality to his actions, and he doesn't even have a good sense of humour to add flair to what is essentially a purely destructive rampage. To put it simply, Deathwing is a bad villain, who probably dresses up as Harley Quinn at Halloween parties and runs around telling people how unique he is and that he's not like other girls. So that brings us on to Mists of Pandaria, but for the discussion of that story and all the more recent expansions, including the return of Illidan, the rise of Blue Teaster, and the adventures of Sigma male Garrosh Hellscream and his time-travelling genocidal grind set, you'll have to wait for the next episode. It'd just be too long for my smooth brain to concentrate on covering all of this material in one video. I had a lot of fun making this one, guys. It took me back to some of my earliest videos, and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you enjoyed it and want to stick around for the second half, consider subscribing to the channel. There will be more like this. I don't know if that's a promise or a threat, but hey, be well guys, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.